it's interesting. Someone was saying to me in front of my boss the other day, well, we've now left the EU, so does she get fired? Sort of as a joke, and he said no, she sort of technically becomes the most important person here. And it's interesting, was being said previously about sort of it being good for certain sort of trades. Professionally speaking, I've never been so busy because people are thinking, big question mark, what next? It's a lot of work for the government, certainly. I think I went around doing a roadshow of EU sort of what happens in the event of Brexit kind of shows across the country. And I think one of the things that we were trying to stress was that in terms of the longer term impact on business, it was really going to be a lot of work first for the government, and there was a question mark over how much that would trickle down, apart from the big uncertainty question, uncertainty factor, how much that would actually trickle down to business. And I think some of that is driven by this notion of what drives trade. We've heard so much discussion. I've never heard so many politicians talk about trade agreements as I have in the last month. It's funny because they weren't saying much about a lot of the EU trade agreements that were bebeing negotiated in the run-up, basically in the last 10, 20 years. You didn't hear many people talking about TTIP, so everyone is suddenly sort of championing the prospect of free trade agreements, I think, without sort of understanding what should be in the content of them, how important are trade agreements for trade. And I think the way we need to look at it to some extent is that what Brexit entails in terms of, at least on the potentially negative side for business, in terms of trade prospects, I think is potentially increasing the cost of doing trade, which is nothing to be sniffed at. But there was a lot of modelling done about how much it would lead to trade diversion in terms of if we left the EU, would that fundamentally alter firms' trading patterns? And I certainly don't think in the short to medium term that would happen. We know that generally speaking, what drives trade, international trade among businesses is demand for your goods and services, the quality of your products and what you have to offer. Having said that, being part of the EU does bring, in terms of being a formal part of the single market, does bring a huge benefit in terms of keeping administrative burdens low. So if we look at, I'm going to divide what I'm going to talk about into sort of the impact on EU trade policy and then looking out to the rest of the world. And if we look at the different models and the options, and I'm really going to sort of narrow it to the EEA or a version of the EEA and a bilateral trade deal, I don't think the Swiss option, in so much as it's really an option, it was the Swiss model is sort of a description of a sort of series of processes that's been taking place over sort of 10, 20, 25 years. So it's not really a sort of formal model to go for. There is obviously the Turkish option, well, the customs union, but that sort of is very limited to trade in goods and certainly not all goods. So we're really looking at a version of the EEA or the EEA itself or a bilateral trade deal. And in terms of process, obviously, we're talking about triggering Article 50. I think it's politically and legally almost impossible for anyone to really seriously take seriously the prospect of repealing just unilaterally the 72 Communities Act. It would be incredibly messy legally and afford very little protection for businesses going forward. So we do have that 2-year process that's sort of provided for by Article 50. It's not a veto as such. It was mentioned there's a blocking minority. What there is a veto is on the sort of question arises about can we get, if we go for the bilateral trade deal option, can we get that all done in the 2-year period? That to extend that period requires unanimous consent from all 28. The vote on the final deal is done by QMV, and that's where the blocking minorities come into effect. It's interesting that I feel like I spend my day every single day trying to track all of the various comments about what process is going to kick off where. And I think the problem with that is not having triggered Article 50 right away. There are merits and demerits for not having done that, obviously. But it was interesting today, we had... the Commission was asked during its midday lunchtime press briefing about what were the legalities around could the UK even informally start these sort of scoping exercises, sort of what constitutes informal talks with other countries about trade deals. And they basically said, we're not going to give you any sort of guidance publicly or informally until you trigger Article 50, which I thought was a very clever response. It was interesting to hear the EU Trade Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström, say that, and I think she actually spoke a little bit out of turn, this was more of a political statement rather than a de facto legal one, but she basically said that in terms of the agreements that have to be negotiated to actually leave the EU once Article 50 is triggered, you're talking about an actual withdrawal agreement, unbounding the UK from its formal legal obligations to the EU, and also a new an agreement to constitute a new relationship between the UK and the EU. And she was saying that you would have to do one first. They couldn't be done in parallel. So you'd have to do one first, and then the UK would default thereafter, once that was put in place, to WTO rules, which are obviously considered to be, by popular consensus, the sort of worst case scenario to a certain extent, because that's the sort of prospect under which the highest amount of tariffs, although they're still pretty low at the WTO level in terms of averages, would kick in, and then you would negotiate from there. I think both camps from the UK and the EU side have no idea really what they're going to do, and that will not become clear until Article 50 is triggered. I think you could do those negotiations in parallel. I don't like to use Greenland as a precedent very often because it's such a unique case. But if you look at the way that Greenland, which was part of Denmark, withdrew from the European Economic Community, Common Market, those negotiations were done in parallel, and you had a transitional agreement that was drawn up to be put in place until the new terms of the new agreement came into effect. That's different because Greenland became an overseas sort of country, territory of the EU, and that option's not open to the UK. So I think from a business perspective, if you were to look at it just purely on what's the easiest way to go down, obviously the EEA provides a certain level of continuity. I think what's very important to the sort of shipping industry these days is sort of financial issues, financing sort of ships, insurance issues. And if you retain the sort of Europe single market through the EEA, those passporting rights to be able to operate across the EU are preserved. I don't think the EEA is all that it's sort of cracked up to be necessarily in some areas, even though, you don't have the sort of same issue about import duties that you would probably have to worry about if you were negotiating a bilateral trade deal. You do have issues around customs declarations. You're outside of the customs union, so all of a sudden things like import and export declarations become an issue. And these aren't fundamentally going to, I think, alter firms' trading patterns, but it does increase the administrative burden. So it's interesting, you talk to a lot of firms who export and they say, sometimes it takes twice as long for my goods to get to Norway as it does to get to an EU member state. So I think you're really looking at the potential for the cost of doing what you already do going up slightly. But obviously that wouldn't come into effect until the new agreement came in. There's also, I suppose, to some degree, an argument that if you go for the EEA model, that is a little bit more straightforward and would take a less amount of time because it's provided for, there's a route provided for. Many people would argue that you have to the UK would have to rejoin the European Free Trade Association first to then become a contracting party to the EEA agreement again. But the timescale for that is much more sort of narrower, I think, and a bit more straightforward than going down the bilateral trade deal route. And I think it's very true to say what was sort of mentioned by the previous speaker about politics is really important. I think every time I'm asked for a comment sort of predicting what is the potential for the negotiations, which direction of travel they will go to, it's hard to give a finite answer because of the politics of the situation, really. I have a lot of friends in Brussels who say that they are genuinely, by instinct, free traders, but making sure that it's not easy for other countries to leave the EU is the most important precedent. And I think we have to remember also that while on the one hand we are talking about a situation that has never occurred before, we're talking about potentially re-erecting trade barriers. There's no trade negotiations in the world in the history of multilateral, regional, bilateral negotiations that has been aimed potentially at re-erecting or erecting trade barriers. The trend has always been to sort of decrease them and reduce them. So this is uncharted territory. But with sort of keeping that in mind, I think we shouldn't forget that there are some countries who might see this as an opportunity, even industries, to protect their own products and services. So if we look at, for example, the chemicals industry, we've seen that during the EU-US trade negotiations, Poland really didn't want tariff reductions, and they would see this as an opportunity to sort of re-erect tariff barriers to protect their own industry. There's a question around, certainly, if we go for the EEA model, even though that preserves for trading businesses single market access, unrestricted single market access, The issue around sort of complying by European regulations becomes an issue with the recently agreed sort of EU port regulation. It's very likely that continues to apply to the UK in terms of sort of condition for single market access. So that's an area where regulatory sort of issues just does become an issue for industry, and you have to look at it through trade-offs. I want to talk very quickly about non-EU trade prospects, because you hear so many different things. We heard President Obama say in the run-up to sort of the referendum that the UK would be at the back of the queue for a new trade deal. There's a question about, would we have to do a new trade deal? Potentially we could sign up to, and actually the US trade representative has said that he is open to the UK joining if it leaves the EU, when it leaves the EU, TTIP, as sort of an add-on almost in a sense. And I think here there are political issues, because on the one hand you have the Commission hinting that the UK is bound by the EU's exclusive competence in commercial, i.e. trade policy, in terms of entering into any kind of negotiations with other countries. And I think that we should remember that for all that you hear from certain Brexiteer ministers talking about scoping exercises are not negotiations. If scoping exercises with other countries for bilateral trade deals were in any way tantamount to negotiations, it would mean that as soon as in the past you have, for example, the US and the EU did a feasibility study before they entered into negotiations, and if they were in any way similar, it would have meant that as soon as the negotiations started, you'd be done, in effect, that you would have the trade deal, you'd already done the scoping exercise, so you could just get on with it. Well, that was 4 years ago, and we're still in negotiations. So they are very different kettles of fish. We've had David Davis talking about, I think in the Commons yesterday, that we should just be able to get on and talk to whoever we want. That potentially, depending on how the UK approaches this, and this is where I think sometimes ministers would do well not to be too bullish publicly. If they really want to get on with doing these trade talks, they should do them in a bit more sort of understated manner, because framing it in a way that says we will do whatever we want, who cares about sanctions procedures, I think the UK could find itself subject to an awful lot of cases before the European Court before it's actually able to leave the EU. So I think that you have to be sort of smart about how you go about informal talks, so to speak. And then there's obviously issues around, in terms of priorities. Obviously, we don't have trade negotiators. I read an article a few weeks ago that was saying we might have sort of 30 to 40. We might have 30 to 40 UK nationals working in the European Commission in their trade directorate who could come back, but we don't have obviously any of our own. And the issue with trade negotiators is that particularly when you're looking at issues around services liberalization, mutual recognition of services, you need to have trade negotiators who know their own regulatory systems. And that's why just borrowing some from New Zealand is not necessarily going to get you the end result that you want. And generally speaking, the way that trade negotiations work is that you don't have people working on the same trade negotiators. So each trade negotiator who is responsible for one country's negotiations is not doing work on separate negotiations at the same time. So depending on your level of ambition, and let's remember that I think the immediate priority in terms of trade negotiations is the new relationship with the EU, I think formal negotiations with new third country markets will probably sort of come at the tail end in terms of priorities, because we obviously as well have countries that we already have preferential access to through existing EU trade agreements that will have to be renegotiated. It might be a simple question of just re-ratifying them with the third countries, but these countries might see this as a way to try and sort of extract better leverage from and better market access to the UK. And there's obviously the issue about at the World Trade Organization level, the UK's access to countries that aren't governed by any existing EU trade deals. They may want to renegotiate that access as well. So it's a lot of work for the government at the moment. I mean, it's interesting that, I can't see, I'd like domestically to see a lot more priority being given to domestic issues in equal measure to Brexit, but this is going to take up the government's time for quite a while. And so I think, the idea that you can do concurrently, giving the same level of ambition to new trade agreement negotiations while we're trying to exit the EU might be slightly idealistic. And it's difficult because no one wants to talk their country's prospects down. I think this is a huge actually opportunity for the UK to try and sort of set its own new trade policy and make inroads where the EU has failed to do that before, because it has to be subject to the competing interests, not just within one country, but within 28. But I think the idea really, if you look at something like the Jones Act, which most people in here will probably know about, which really requires, if any ships moving between U.S. ports to be, say, fly under a U.S. flag, 75% of the crew has to be U.S. citizen, has to be a U.S.-owned ship. People were saying, well, now we can get this, they couldn't get that changed as part of TTIP, so we're going to get it done with the U.S. Just because the US is an ally of ours doesn't mean that those industries aren't going to lobby very, very hard in any US-UK deal. So I think a little bit of realism about what the prospects are, at least in the short term, for new trade agreements is required. Thank you very much.
Just time for one or two questions, if any.
Thank you. Tim Reardon from the Chamber of Shipping. You've given us a very comprehensive sort of strategic overview, and I wonder whether I could draw you out on a couple of specifics, in particular the administrative burdens and the extra costs associated with just getting stuff across borders between the UK and its continental neighbours if the negotiations don't go the way one might want them to go. Quite a lot of the traffic, particularly ro-ro traffic, depends upon speed and it depends upon free flow through the port. If we look, for example, at, say, Spanish salads coming in to the UK market, or indeed Scottish shellfish going out in the other direction to restaurants in France, absolutely vital that that moves quickly and isn't held up at the port. What would you think is likely to come into force or to replace the current regulatory arrangements for that kind of trade? Clearly it's not an issue of free tariffs, it's an issue of administrative ease of getting the truck through the port and onto the ship and off at the other end. What do you think the likely outcome is in relation to that kind of traffic?
It probably to some extent obviously depends on the model that we go for. The EEA, even though it's not a customs union, there are still, we don't have import duties to have to worry about. But some of it depends on what the UK does, what its own sort of customs code is, the approach it adopts, and some of it depends on the EU's. You never hear it's a very, I think, in political circles, trade facilitation measures and customs issues is sort of, even though it's obviously the bread and butter for businesses themselves, it's not really talked about in the same context because it's not as interesting politically. And so I think a lot could depend on whether the UK decides to adopt a relatively flexible approach to its customs code post Brexit. I don't think it will necessarily become a bargaining chip in the same way, agricultural tariffs might be, for example. But I don't think you can completely discount it. At the end of the day, if we're not part of the customs union, as I mentioned, we have a lot of members who say it takes twice as long to get products to Norway as it does to any other EU member state. So at the end of the day, I can't see a situation in which the burden is going to be reduced or really stay the same.
There was one more question, I think, just
Good afternoon. Alan McCarthy from the International Maritime Industries Forum. You touched upon TTIP once or twice there. Is it possible to give just a very brief description as to where we are with TTIP negotiations, and assuming the UK wanted to be part of those, whether it could be a separate signatory to it outside of the EU, accepting all of the terms which the EU and the USA have agreed?
Yeah, it's interesting. Today I saw John Kerry saying that the deal's on track to be concluded by the end of the year, which is news to me, because the last round of negotiations last week, I didn't see any sort of momentous announcements about sort of breakthroughs and things like geographic indications and government public procurement, for example. I don't think it'll be finished by the end of the year. You had the sort of first Vice President of the Commission a few months ago, Mr. Timmermans, saying he didn't think it would be. And I think part of the issue here is that you all may may or may not have seen that the EU-Canada deal, which is sort of, I suppose, seen as something of a template for TTIP, was recently declared to be a mixed agreement by the Commission, which means that, at least in theory, it has to be ratified by all 28 parliaments. You've already had Greece saying it won't ratify it because it hasn't received enough protection for feta cheese as a name, for example. So I certainly don't see it. I haven't seen any momentous breakthroughs coming into effect. I still think it's certainly possible for TTIP to be agreed if it's not sort of... Then again, there is also, I should quickly mention that even though it's been declared a mixed agreement and therefore requires ratification, a lot of the areas like around tariff reduction and elimination, which are exclusive competence of the EU, can be provisionally applied before ratification in all 28. So you can actually apply both CETA and TTIP once it's sort of concluded. My guess is that TTIP will probably be done sometime sort of early to mid next year. But it's interesting that I think I've seen sort of some commentariat, sort of some of the commentariat saying that the UK sort of by default assuming that the UK would be excluded from CETA and TTIP. I don't think the Commission, politically at least, can sort of say on the one hand the UK can't engage in any talks with other countries, and on the other say the UK is excluded from TTIP. So I mean, you have a lot of trade economists actually disagreeing about what are the legalities, and until the Commission sort of comes forward with its own legal advice, it's hard to make a finite judgment. But I think that if TTIP were to be concluded before the UK formally leaves the EU and the new terms of the New Deal come into place, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't apply to the UK. But I mean, you have the US trade rep saying that he doesn't see any problem for the UK signing up to TTIP as sort of an add-on further down the line. I think the Commission might have something to say about that as well.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Allie.